Welcome to Husband Talking. Explore riveting tales of infidelity with us. Please subscribe and like to stay updated. Let's begin.
Just as the doorbell rang, we had just finished our meal. My 13-year-old daughter, Sophie, leaped up to get it before her brother or I could react. She came back quickly, a confused expression on her face. "Dad, there's a policeman. He wants to speak with you," she said. A jolt of fear shot through me, but I tried to hide it. I went to the door and saw that it was actually a New York State trooper. "Are you John Blake?" the trooper asked. Yes, I confirmed. "Are you the husband of Linda Shaw Blake?" When I nodded, the trooper looked at my two kids and said, "May I speak with you in private, Mr. Donovan?" My throat constricted, and I had to clear it before I could speak. "Ben, Sophie, please go to your rooms. I need to speak with the officer alone." They began to protest, but when I barked, "Now," they jumped and hurried to their rooms. They weren't used to hearing that tone from me. Once they were gone, the officer turned back to me. "Mr. Donovan, I've been asked to give you some bad news. Your wife's airplane is missing and presumed down. It dropped off the radar tonight approximately halfway between Boston Logan Airport and Bermuda. A Coast Guard ship is in the area now looking for survivors." The facts were straightforward enough. In her role as a regional sales VP for a major multinational corporation, Sarah had set out to visit their Caribbean headquarters in Bermuda, accompanied by the region's chief financial officer. She was an experienced small plane pilot, so the flight to Bermuda should have been routine. I hadn't thought much of it when Sarah called to let me know her plans. Now I was distraught. This had to be my worst nightmare. My wife's plane had crashed at night in the shark-infested waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The officer provided a few additional details that did nothing to give me any encouragement before he left, promising that the Coast Guard would call with updates in the morning or earlier if there was any news. No sooner had the door closed behind the trooper than both Ben and Sophie came running to my side, anxiety written on their faces, asking questions I couldn't answer. I knew they had been listening. I would have eavesdropped too if I'd been in their shoes. The three of us clung to each other, each trying to find encouraging things to say to the others. Sophie began to cry, and although he was trying to be brave, Ben's eyes were red as well. I did my best to keep it together for their sake, but inside, I was frantic. There was no thought of cleaning the dishes or doing homework. Our anguish kept us within arm's length of each other for the rest of the evening. It grew past their normal bedtime, but still no phone call came. Finally, exhausted by the lateness of the hour and our fears, all three of us gravitated to the master bedroom, and the kids slept with me for the first time since they were little and afraid of thunderstorms. We were up and trying to eat breakfast the next morning when a representative from the Coast Guard called. The slim hope stirred by the call was quickly dashed when the officer told me that the cutter searching the area had found nothing. I called the principal at the middle school the kids attended to let her know why Ben and Sophie would be absent that day. Then I went to check on them, only to find them in front of the television, watching a report on the missing plane on CNN. I wasn't sure whether to let them keep watching or turn the set off, but before I could reach a decision, the phone began to ring again. From that point on, whenever I hung up from one call, another would come in. The first calls were from Sarah's parents and my own, all frantic with worry while trying to project a false optimism that she would miraculously be found. I promised to call back immediately with any news. Next came the calls from our friends and Sarah's colleagues. All wanted to say or do something to help, but none of them had any idea how. The conversations were short and awkward. Most difficult of all were the calls from the media. I should have expected those, but I was caught off guard when the first reporter called, and I talked to the reporter from the Times much longer than I wanted. Then representatives from other media began calling, and when I realized what was happening, I began screening all the calls, returning only those from people I cared about. During all this, neighbors and friends started coming by with condolences and food. At first, their generosity was appreciated because I had no energy for preparing meals. But soon we had more food than we could hope to eat in a week. It was an old tradition to express concern and condolences with food, but while I appreciated the gesture, every roast and casserole was a bitter reminder that my wife of 18 years was almost certainly dead. The next few days were horrible. We were virtual prisoners in our own home, kept there by our desire not to deal with other people and by our hope for some news from the Coast Guard. I made daily calls to the office in Boston for updates, but the reports were always negative. Then, 5 days after the trooper had arrived at our doorstep, came the news we'd been dreading. A Coast Guard officer called to tell me that wreckage from Sarah's plane had been found. There were no signs of any survivors. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer concluded, "but we're going to have to suspend search and rescue operations at this time." I wanted nothing more than to hide away and mourn in solitude, but that option wasn't available. Instead, I faced a seemingly endless list of painful responsibilities. The worst, of course, was having to tell Ben and Sophie the sad news and trying to console them. When they finally calmed down, I had to phone relatives and close friends to let them know. Next was a call to our church to arrange a memorial service, followed by one to the newspaper to submit an obituary. Then came more calls to share the time and date of the service. By the time I was done, I felt physically and emotionally exhausted. Somehow, we made it through the service and began the slow, painful process of trying to resume a normal life. The following week, the kids returned to school, and the resumption of their routine seemed to help a little. I was not so fortunate. A whole new set of duties fell on my shoulders. At the urging of a friend, I contacted an attorney to find out what my legal responsibilities were. I was shocked to learn that I would have to petition for a death certificate. "But her plane crashed at sea," I protested. "How can there be any doubt?" "I know," the attorney commiserated, "but in the absence of a body and a physician's certificate, the court must make a formal declaration." "Am I going to have to wait 7 years?" I asked in distress. "No," the attorney assured me. "In a case like this, where an individual has been lost at sea, there's usually no significant delay. You may have to answer some questions, but typically such cases are resolved very quickly. I can get the petition started for you," he went on. "I can also help you get all your other documents changed." When I looked confused, the attorney explained, like any joint bank accounts, your mortgage, your insurance, car titles, your will, anything like that. "While I do that, you need to contact your wife's company to see about any benefits you may be entitled to, as well as to claim any personal belongings." I shook my head in weariness. In my grief, I hadn't stopped to think just how complicated it would be to untangle the life Sarah and I had shared. Now I faced another chore that I dreaded, calling on the widow of David Shaw, the financial executive who had been on the plane with Sarah. ID met Linda Shaw only a couple of times at company functions, but ID taken an immediate dislike to her husband. In my eyes, he was one of those egotistical types who thought he was smarter than everyone else. In the brief time I spent with him, he managed to drop enough names and boast about his accomplishments enough to leave a bad taste in my mouth. But that wasn't his widow's fault, I reminded myself, and I felt I had a duty to call on her. I phoned ahead, so Linda Shaw was expecting me. As we exchanged condolences, I realized she was probably the only one who truly knew how I was feeling. When we were seated in her living room, she asked kindly, "So, how are you doing now, John?" "It's hard, Linda Shaw. It's really hard. I just can't accept that she's really gone. So many things keep reminding me of her." I shook my head helplessly. "You know what's the hardest thing? When I'm out on the street or in a crowd, I keep thinking that I've spotted her. The other day, I must have scared some poor woman half to death when I chased her down because I thought she was Sarah." I looked at the floor, recalling the memory and my emotions when I realized what I was doing. Linda Shaw watched me with sympathetic eyes. She knew there weren't any words to help. Finally, I looked up at her and asked, "How about you, Linda Shaw? How are you doing?" "It's not easy, John, but I'm going to make it," she told me. "The truth is, I'm probably doing much better than you. David and I didn't have any children, so I don't have two to console the way you do. Also," she hesitated, "and I wouldn't tell this to anyone else, David and I weren't getting along very well before all this happened. ID caught him having a couple of flings in the past, and I think he was in the middle of another affair. If this hadn't happened, we'd probably be headed for divorce before too long." "I'm so sorry to hear that, Linda Shaw," I told her sympathetically. "I can only imagine the conflicting emotions you must be feeling." "Yes," she agreed. "One moment I'm relieved that I don't have to deal with his cheating anymore, and the next I'm filled with guilt because I don't feel sadder. And despite everything, there's a part of me that still misses him." "Are you going to be okay financially?" I asked, trying to change the subject. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "The good news is that the company provided life insurance on David, and because he died while on business with the double indemnity clause, he'll receive twice the face value. The bad news is I'm going to need every penny of that money because I've learned David made a series of bad investments in the futures market and severely depleted our net worth." What Linda Shaw said about her late husband did not surprise me. It took no stretch of the imagination to believe that an egotist like David Shaw would not prove a faithful husband. For that matter, the idea that Martin would fancy himself a wheeler-dealer in the market was entirely in keeping with my mental picture of the man. What grabbed my attention was Linda Shaw's mention of the company-paid life insurance. I remembered my attorney's advice and made a mental note to contact the benefits department of Sarah's company right away. If Martin had been covered, surely Sarah would have had a similar policy, and until I could find a job, those funds might come in very handy. After chatting a few minutes longer, I arose from the couch. Linda Shaw, please forgive me, but I'm going to have to cut my visit short. Ben and Sophie will be getting out of school soon, and I've got to go pick them up. But please stay in touch, and if there's anything I can do to help, even if you just need a sympathetic ear to bend, please don't hesitate to call me. When I drove up to our home after picking up Ben and Sophie, I was surprised to see a car parked out front. I got my children into the house through the garage, and a minute later, the doorbell rang. Outside were a man who looked to be in his 50s and a younger woman, both dressed in business attire. I'm Special Agent Jack Thompson, the man introduced himself, and this is Special Agent Anna Carter. We're with the New York Bureau of Investigation. We'd like to come in and ask you a few questions in conjunction with your wife's disappearance. When she realized they were law enforcement officers, Sophie wrapped her arms around my waist and buried her face in my side. I could feel her tears dampening my shirt, and I held her tightly. What's this about? I demanded angrily. Before the first agent could speak, Agent Murray interceded. I'm so sorry we've upset your daughter, Mr. Donovan. All we're trying to do is complete a routine check in connection with your petition for a death certificate for Mrs. Donovan. If you'd like us to come back later, we'll try to do so at a time that would be better for you. I ignored her and turned to face my daughter. It's all right, honey. Nothing bad has happened. The female agent bent down on one knee, reached into her purse, pulled out a tissue, and handed it to Sophie. Here, honey, she said in a gentle voice. Sophie hesitated, then shyly accepted the tissue, wiping her eyes and blowing her nose. When I saw that my daughter had calmed down, I put my arm around her and spoke to her. These people need to talk with me a while about your mom, Sophie. Why don't you go get started on your homework? They'll be right out here in the living room if you need me. With that, I gently pushed my daughter toward her room. Then I turned to face the officers. If it won't take too long, let's go ahead and get this over with. The three of us stepped into the living room and seated ourselves around a coffee table. We just need to get a little background information on your wife, Mr. Donovan, the male agent began. How long were the two of you married? We got married in 1991, right after we both graduated from Syracuse University. I replied, thinking back to the beautiful brunette co-ed I had wooed and won so many years ago. And she was employed by International Marketing Corporation up until her disappearance. That's right, I confirmed. She was sales vice president for the Northeastern U.S. If her region was the Northeast, why would she have been traveling to Bermuda? The younger woman asked. At IMC, I explained the Northeast included Bermuda as well as the U.S. Their Caribbean headquarters are in Bermuda, so it wasn't uncommon for Sarah to fly down there. Sarah? The woman asked. I felt my voice grow husky. Sarah was my pet name for her. Agent Murray reached across and patted my hand sympathetically. That's all right, Mr. Donovan. I know this is hard for you. The older agent decided to change the line of questioning. Was it normal for your wife to fly her own plane on business trips? Yes, I replied. Sarah's dad was a pilot, and she got her license as soon as she was old enough. She took every opportunity to fly herself because she said it made her independent of commercial airline schedules. She used to say she could get where she needed to be, complete her business, and be back home while the competition was still stuck in the terminal. She felt like it gave her an edge, especially when she was starting out. The two agents made notes. Then Agent Murray looked up at me. And what about you, Mr. Donovan? What do you do? I managed to smile. I'm a house husband. Seeing their looks, I went on. I was an aerospace engineer up until 3 years ago when my company cut back and I was laid off. The only prospects I could find for a new job would have required me to relocate out of state. But in the meantime, Sarah's job was going great. She'd gotten a couple of major promotions and was earning a great salary, plus big bonuses. It didn't make sense for her to quit, so we agreed that I'd manage the household and take care of the kids while she worked. And how did this change affect your relationship with Mrs. Donovan? Agent Burns asked. Why is that relevant? I asked irritably. Please bear with us, Mr. Donovan. The younger woman interceded. We are required to check to see if there could be any factors that might have played a role in your wife's disappearance. It's all routine. Somewhat mollified, I looked at the two of them. Of course, it was a big change for me, but I'm an engineer. I'm trained to measure and assess all the factors in a design. It was easy to see that my changing roles was the right thing for our family at that time. It made it possible for Sarah to devote herself to her career, and I made sure that Ben and Sophie always had a parent there for them at all times. Neither of the agents said anything, and I felt as though the question was still hanging in the air. I don't mean it was easy, I went on. She was always calling on customers or attending meetings at corporate, so I didn't see as much of her as I would have liked. Sometimes it felt like her job came first. I suddenly realized what I was saying and added swiftly, but that's pretty much par for the course in corporate life. Besides, it worked out well. I caught myself. Until now. Just 2 more questions, Mr. Donovan, Agent Burns said, writing on his pad. Did you notice any changes in your wife's behavior in the time prior to her disappearance? Not really, I replied after a moment's thought. I know she was under a lot of pressure in the last year or so, and her travel schedule was heavier than ever. But Sarah said she was in line for a major promotion. When she got it, she promised the new job would cut down on her travel as well as come with a high-level title and a big bump in her salary. Last question, Agent Burns said, writing on his pad. Are you aware of any changes in your finances that your wife might have made in the last few months? No, I replied with certainty. I keep up with all our finances, and I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary. The young woman glanced at her partner. I think we've taken enough of your time, Mr. Donovan. We should be able to wrap all this up pretty quickly, and we'll let you know as soon as we've concluded. In the meantime, if you think of anything you feel we should know, please call me at this number. As she spoke, she handed me her card, and the 2 agents headed for the door. I headed back to my kids' rooms to make sure they were getting their homework done. Both looked busy when I peeked in. They're strong kids, I thought. They've been through hell and they're holding up well, all things considered. The next day, I drove to IMC headquarters to pay a visit to the benefits department. The head of the department met me and, after expressing her condolences, handed over a box filled with Sarah's personal effects from her office. I had to swallow hard when I saw the framed family portrait she had kept on her desk. The director then turned me over to a specialist to advise me on Sarah's benefits. The first order of business was to look at Sarah's 401k account. I had regularly seen her annual statements, so I wasn't expecting any surprises. When I saw the final total, however, it was quite a bit higher than I had expected. Apparently, during the last year, Sarah had upped her contributions to the plan, putting in more than the company would match. She was really trying to provide for her family, the specialist commented with admiration. The specialist went on to advise me to withdraw the funds as soon as possible and roll them over into my own IRA so that I could more easily manage the funds. The other surprise I got was the sheet I received outlining the life insurance benefit I would receive as Sarah's beneficiary. I learned that Sarah had opted for the maximum amount of insurance for which she was eligible. With the accidental death multiplier, I was amazed to realize that I would receive almost 4 years' worth of Sarah's income. The insurance company will pay that out in annual installments, the woman explained. Otherwise, the taxes would eat you alive. Payment of all of the benefits, of course, was contingent on the company's receiving a copy of Sarah's death certificate. But after the visit from the 2 GBI agents, I felt confident that would be forthcoming soon. I left the office building much relieved. I had thought I would have to begin an immediate search for another job. Now I realized I had a significant grace period to get my life together. Thank you, Sarah, I whispered fervently. I was making dinner for the family late one afternoon several days later when the doorbell rang. When I went to answer, I found Special Agent Murray on my doorstep again. After ID asked her in, she explained the purpose of her visit. Mr. Donovan, I wanted to let you know in person that our investigation has been completed and that your wife's death certificate has been issued. You should receive a copy from the court by certified mail in the next few days. I heaved a sigh of relief. I had believed there would be no problems, but it was a relief to know this important task had been accomplished. Just then, a panicked scream came from the back of the house, and I was horrified to hear Sophie's voice yelling, "Help me! Daddy, help me!" I turned and sprinted for Sophie's room. Alice Walker was right on my heels, her hand reaching for the service revolver in the shoulder holster under her jacket. When I burst into Sophie's room, I found my daughter staring at a large red bloodstain on her jeans. "I'm bleeding, Daddy," she wailed. I was terrified. "What happened, Sophie? Did you cut yourself?" As I started for her side, a hand caught my elbow and pulled me back with surprising strength. "Let me handle this," Alice said firmly and pushed me toward the door. But I protested, but the young woman would not be moved. "They'll handle this, John. Just go out in the living room and wait." Something about the authority in her voice made me pause, and with the determined young woman blocking my way, I tentatively stepped back into the hallway. Alice calmly closed the door in my face. After 15 anxious minutes, the door opened, and Alice came out. Before I could ask a question, she grasped my arm. "Sophie is fine. You need to go to the store right now and buy a package of sanitary napkins. Get the smallest size they have." But Sophie, Ben, I began to protest. "They'll take care of Sophie and let Ben know what's happening. You just need to go to the store and get back here as fast as you can," she said. As I drove to a nearby convenience store, the realization hit me, and I began to berate myself. "She started having her menstrual period, you idiot. You should have realized that immediately." On the return trip, I continued to curse myself for never talking to my daughter about the maturation into womanhood. "Oh, Sarah, I need you more than ever," I thought in self-pity. When I got home, Alice met me at the front door and snatched the bag away from me. After looking at the package, she smiled. "You did good, Dad." Then she disappeared back into Sophie's room. After 30 more minutes, Alice reappeared with her arm around Sophie, who hung back somewhat shyly. I fell to my knees and hugged my daughter when she came to me. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I should have talked with you about this a long time ago. I just didn't think about it." "It's okay, Daddy," Sophie spoke up. "I just didn't know what was happening, and I was scared." Alice explained it all to me. "I know what to do now." As she spoke, she slipped her hand into Alice's, and I realized my daughter had made a new friend. I stood and turned to Alice. "Thank you so much. It's a good thing you were here. I guess I panicked for a moment. I'm afraid I'm not so good with girls." Alice smiled, but before she could speak, Ben popped around the corner. "Just because my dumb little sister has her first period, does that mean we're not going to have any dinner tonight? I'm starving, Ben." Sophie shrieked, but I grabbed her before she could attack her big brother. "Ben, if you talk like that to your sister again, I guarantee you'll be going to bed hungry," I warned my son. But before my threat could sound too ominous, I went on, "Now go wash your hands and set the table." Then I turned back to Alice. "The least we can do is offer you a meal for all you've done. It isn't exactly gourmet cooking, but there's plenty to eat." The young woman was clearly embarrassed. "Thank you, but I can't intrude." Her protestations were halted, however, when Sophie tugged on her hand. "Please, Alice, please stay and eat with us." Gazing at her new friend, Alice smiled and said, "All right, Sophie, just for you." Looking up at me, she smiled again. "Thank you. I'd love to have dinner with your family." The four of us sat down to eat, and Alice found herself the target of numerous questions from the two kids about her experiences in law enforcement. I ate and listened, both in amusement at my children's curiosity and in admiration at the easy way Alice handled their questions. I suddenly realized that this was the first time the two of them had really seemed to come out of the shell of their sorrow. When dessert was over, I shooed Ben and Sophie off to do their homework, then offered Alice a cup of coffee. As the two of us sat at the table, I got a chance to ask my own questions. "You certainly seem to be comfortable with Ben and Sophie. Do you work a lot with young people?" She smiled. "Actually, I come from a big family, 2 brothers and 3 sisters. I was the oldest, so I guess I was second mom to the rest of them." She paused to take a sip of her coffee, then went on. "That's why I knew what to do with Sophie this afternoon. I got to walk each of my sisters through the trauma of puberty." She looked at me and smiled again. "For what it's worth, my dad was just as helpless as you were today." I grinned sheepishly. "Well, all I can say is I'm glad you happened to be here." Even when I finally realized what was going on, I still wouldn't have known how to get Sophie calmed down so quickly. She smiled to acknowledge my thanks, then her expression grew more serious. "How are they coping with the loss of their mother?" she asked. I sighed. "About as well as can be expected, I think. Sophie has been very clingy. I think she's really missing the female influence." As for Ben, it's hard to tell. He's been sullen and somewhat withdrawn, but I don't know whether that's the result of Sarah's death or just the fact that he's a teenager now. Alice looked at me sympathetically. From what I've seen, I think you're doing a great job with them. It's just going to take time for them and for you. With that, she stood and said, I really enjoyed the meal, John, but I've intruded on your family far too long. I need to get going, but if it's all right, I'd like to say goodbye to Ben and Sophie. When I nodded, she walked down the hall, and I heard her say goodbye to Ben. Then she spent a few minutes in Sophie's room, and when she returned, Sophie came with her, her arm around Alice's waist. She really has made a new friend, I thought in wonder. A couple of days later, a package arrived in the mail for Sophie. When my excited daughter tore open the wrapping, she found a pink stuffed elephant along with a note from Alice. I was gratified by the thoughtfulness but amused by the selection. Sophie's too old for stuffed animals, I thought, but I was surprised to see the toy given a prominent place on Sophie's bed. I guess there's still some little girl left in her yet, I conceded. I called Alice's office the next day to thank her. I would never have thought of that, I admitted, but somehow it was just the right thing for Sophie. Alice was delighted that my daughter was pleased with her gift and made me promise to keep in touch and let her know how Sophie and Ben were doing. A couple of weeks later, I was paying bills one morning when I got a call from Ben's homeroom teacher. I'd like to meet with you to talk about your son, the teacher told me. He's having some discipline problems in school. I agreed to meet with her the next day, but I decided not to say anything to Ben that night. I wanted to wait until I learned what was happening before confronting my son. The meeting was set for the following day after class. While the kids were at PE, Mrs. Walsh, the homeroom teacher, told me that Ben's behavior in class had grown worse over the last few months. I didn't want to say anything at first because I know he's been through so much, the teacher explained, but it seems to be getting worse. He's become increasingly disengaged from his classes. He's not doing his homework, and his other teachers tell me he's not paying attention in their classes. He's always done so well up to now, but his grades are really going to plummet this semester if he doesn't do something to turn things around. I was troubled. How much do you think being a teenager has to do with this, Mrs. Walsh? There's no question that's a tough age for kids, especially boys, she told me. But we're used to that. I think his mother's death is affecting him more than he may have let on to you. You may want to consider getting counseling for him. I thanked the woman and returned to my car to wait uneasily for my kids to finish their gym classes. I was upset to learn about the problems Ben was having and was determined to have a long talk with the boy. When I got Ben and Sophie home, I sent Sophie to her room to get started on her homework, then led Ben into the master bedroom. The boy's face darkened. He knew he was in trouble. I recounted my visit with Ben's homeroom teacher and cited some of the examples she had given me. What's going on, Ben? Why are you acting this way? I demanded. No reason, the boy replied sullenly. Come on, you're smarter than that, I shot back. Don't you care about your grades? Not really, Ben mumbled. I was frustrated by my son's unresponsiveness, and in anger, I tried to shame him into a reaction. What would your mother think if she knew you were screwing up? Who cares? Ben shouted back angrily. She was such a witch. In shock and anger, I grabbed my son and yelled at him. Don't you ever speak of your mother that way. How can you say such a thing? In fear at my rage and pain at my strong grip, the boy blurted out, I saw her. I saw her screwing that man. As soon as the words came out of his mouth, he slumped to the bed and began to sob. In astonishment, I sat down beside him, put my arm around him, and held him as though he were a small child. It's all right, I kept repeating, trying to calm his obvious anguish. When Ben's crying had subsided, I lifted his head. It's all right, Ben. I'm not mad at you. Just tell me what you saw. His son looked at him tearfully. It was last fall. You let me ride my bike to school one day, but I forgot my math homework, so I sneaked out at lunch to come home and get it. While I was looking for it in my room, I heard Mom come in. I didn't want her to catch me, so I hid. That's when I heard the man's voice. What man? I asked a little too quickly. I don't know, Ben said. Some guy I never saw before. That's okay, I soothed him. Just tell me what happened next. They came in here, and then it got quiet, so I thought I could sneak out. But then I heard Mom make a funny sound, and I was scared, and I looked in, and they were on the bed, and they were screwing. The words poured out of his mouth faster and faster as though he was desperate to spit them out. When he finished, he began to cry again. Why did she do that, Dad? How could Mom act like such a witch? As I listened to my son's story, I felt myself go numb, but I had no time to deal with my own emotions. My son needed me. I understand, Ben. It's okay. I'm sorry you had to see that, but I'm glad you told me. I took my son gently by the shoulders and turned him around to face me. Sometimes people we love make mistakes or do something we don't like. That doesn't mean we don't love them anymore, it just means we don't like what they did. I don't know why your mother would do that, son, but I know she loved you and Sophie very much. It's the good things she did that I want you to remember about her. I held my son and continued to talk to him for a while longer. When I felt that the boy had calmed down sufficiently, I gently urged him to start on his homework while I went off to the kitchen to get dinner started. Before Ben left, I enjoined him to say nothing to Sophie. The boy promised, and I felt fairly comfortable that he would keep the disturbing news from his sister. The rest of the evening passed without further incident. But once the kids were in bed, my emotions began to erupt. My first reaction was to deny what Ben had told me. My son had to be mistaken or have misinterpreted what he saw. But I couldn't maintain that rationalization very long. My son had been too upset by the experience, and I had to admit a teenager these days would certainly recognize sex when he saw it. With that admission, my thoughts turned bitter. How could Sarah have betrayed me? I had thought we had a good marriage. How could she have been screwing someone on the side? For that matter, who was the other man, and how long had the affair lasted? It's hard enough to lose your wife in a plane crash, I thought in despair. It's worse to learn you lost her long before that. Sleep was slow in coming that night, and the next day, I was in a black mood. It was Tuesday, a day I would normally go to the gym, and after the kids were off to school, I decided to keep the routine. The exercise helped divert my attention, but when I hit the treadmill, my mind returned to Sarah's infidelity. How could Sarah have done that, and in our own bed? I asked. Somehow the location made the betrayal even worse. For that matter, how could she know I wouldn't be home? The answer hit me immediately. It must have been one of the days when I went to the gym. I'm such a creature of habit. She would have been pretty certain the house would be empty. But the answer to that question immediately raised others. If she planned her little assignation to fit my schedule, that doesn't sound like it was a Spiro-Themen thing. How often did she meet him there? Couldn't have been every week. Her travel schedule would have interfered. Every question seemed to raise another, each only adding to my anguish. I did my best to act normally around Ben and Sophie, but over the next few days, I continued to suffer. I found myself making a trip to the drugstore to buy antacids. I never had stomach problems before. Compounding my misery was the lack of anyone to talk to about my discovery. I certainly didn't want to involve my parents or Sarah's. I knew the news would be devastating to them. Likewise, I didn't want to talk to my friends and risk becoming the subject of gossip in the neighborhood. And, I thought, I certainly don't want to risk having any of his schoolmates teasing Ben or Sophie. I felt trapped. I was working at my desk one evening when I noticed Alice Walker's card. She told me to call her if I had any additional information. I remembered. But in truth, I was desperate for any excuse to share my news with someone and get another perspective. I called the cell phone number she had handwritten on the card, and when I identified myself, Alice seemed pleased to hear from me. But her tone changed to one of concern when I told her I needed to talk with her. Are Sophie and Ben okay? She asked anxiously. They are, but I'm not, I replied. Could you possibly have lunch with me tomorrow? This isn't the kind of thing I want to discuss over the phone. She quickly agreed and suggested a place near the NYBI offices where she worked. It's a quiet little place. We should be able to talk, she assured me. When I hung up, I found myself feeling a bit better at the prospect of unburdening myself. Alice was waiting in the restaurant when I came through the door. She smiled in greeting, but her smile quickly disappeared when she saw the pained expression on my face. After we were seated and had placed our orders, she could stand the suspense no longer. For heaven's sake, John, what's happened? You told me to let you know if I had any more information about my wife, I said. Well, I don't know if this is relevant to your investigation, but I just found out that Sarah was cheating on me. As I said that, I was ashamed to feel tears flood my eyes and run down my cheeks. Alice reached across the table and grabbed my hands. Oh, John, that's horrible. Tell me what happened. The whole story of the meeting with Ben's teacher, the confrontation with my son, and Ben's anguished revelation came spilling out, interrupted only by the arrival of our food. Alice listened quietly, letting me tell the story at my own pace. Only when ID reached the end did she speak. "Poor Ben," she said. "It's no surprise he's been acting out in school. This must have been eating away at him ever since it happened. And then, with her death, it's no wonder he's been so conflicted." She released my hands when the waitress had brought our order, but now she leaned across the table to reach for me again. "I can hardly imagine what this has done to you, John," she said quietly, and I could see the sympathy in her eyes. "Was there any indication that something was wrong? Now that you look back, did you see any clue?" "No," I said. "I can't say I saw anything. You know what they say, the husband is always the last to know." I looked down at my untouched plate for a second, then back up at the woman. Ever since she got her big promotion, our sex life had fallen off pretty sharply. But between the pressures of her new role and her travel schedule, I figured it was understandable. I didn't like it, but I felt like I had to accept it for our family's sake. She kept telling me things would get better once she moved up to the national level, but I paused. I guess that wasn't to be. Then I scowled. What's killing me is I don't have any answers. I don't know who the bastard she was sleeping with was. I don't know when their affair started or how long it had been going on. I don't know if she was in love with the guy or if she was planning to leave me. Worst of all, I don't know why she would do that to me and the kids. Alice squeezed my hands. "John, please listen to me. The truth is that you're not likely to ever get the answers to your questions. You're going to have to let all that go. With her death, none of that matters anymore. All you can do is focus on taking care of your family and yourself." "I know you're right," I said, "but it just hurts so bad to be betrayed that way. It makes me wonder when she stopped loving me." "No," Alice said fiercely. "You're wrong. Whatever else may have happened, it's clear that Sarah still cared deeply about you and the kids. Look what you found out at IMC. She bought the maximum life insurance to make sure you all were protected. She maxed out her contributions to the 401k plan to put money away for your future. I don't know what else happened in her life, but those sure look like caring acts to me. Thanks, Alice. They'll try to remember that." As we stood to leave, I looked down at the table. Neither of us had touched our food. "I guess I'm not a very good lunch date," I said wryly. "Don't worry about that," she replied lightly. "Missing a meal or two is probably a good thing for me." I looked down at her slim shape. It sure looks good to me, I thought. Then I was startled to realize I was thinking about her in a sexual way. "It's been a long time," I told myself ruefully. As we walked out the door, she took my arm. "Please stay in touch, John, and let me know if there's anything I can do. I'd really like to help." Then she reached up and gave me a kiss on the cheek. As she turned away, I thought I saw a hint of a blush on her cheeks. Driving back home, I was surprised to find that my mood had lightened. I guess I really needed to get that off my chest, I told myself. The next Saturday, I had been out in the yard picking up limbs that had fallen during a storm. When I got inside, I saw Sophie talking on the telephone. I turned to Ben, who was standing nearby. "Did someone call?" I asked. "No," Ben said dismissively. "She's just talking to her new BFF, Alice." I was surprised. "Does she call Alice often? And what's a BFF?" "Oh, Dad," Ben replied in exasperation, "you're so out of it. BFF is best friend forever." Just then, Sophie looked up and saw me. "Dad, can we ask Alice over for dinner?" "Let me talk to her," I said, extending my hand toward my daughter. When she handed me the phone, I said, "Hi, Alice. I guess you heard that. Would you like to have dinner with Sophie tonight? Ben and I will be here too." I heard her melodic laugh, followed by a quick acceptance. "Great," I said. "Why don't you get here about 6? After we concluded arrangements, I hung up and turned to my daughter. "Well, she's coming," I said. "I hope you're happy." "Oh yes, Dad," she squealed. "Well, in that case, you and Ben need to start doing some straightening up around here so she doesn't think we live like pigs." "Oh, Dad, do I have to?" Ben complained. But before I could reply, the boy turned and started to pick up the clothes head left in the den. He's still a teenager, I thought, but he seems to be doing better. As I turned to head for the kitchen, I began to consider what dish I could make. Definitely something better than spaghetti and meatballs, I thought, remembering the first time Alice had eaten with us. I finally decided on a fish dish I considered one of my specialties. I felt confident in my ability to make it, and the kids liked it well enough, which was always a plus. To do that, I knew I'd have to make a trip to the grocery store. explaining my errand to Ben and Sophie. I enjoined them to stay in the house till I got back. I found a nice piece of salmon in the seafood department and then decided to pick up some dessert from the bakery. I ought to pick up a nice bottle of wine while I'm at it, I thought, and turned my cart down the appropriate aisle. After finding what I wanted, I made a detour to the store's floral department and picked up a bouquet for the table. On my way home, I began to think about what I was doing. I'm really going all out on this meal, I realized in surprise. I finally decided it was because I owed Alice a good meal. After all, I did ruin her lunch, I told myself. Alice rang the doorbell promptly at 6, and before I could get to the door, Sophie was already showing her in. To my amazement, even Ben deigned to present himself, and the teenage boy actually made a little polite conversation. For my part, I found myself feeling a bit awkward and inarticulate, but if she noticed, Alice made no sign. Instead, she chatted happily with Sophie and willingly went with her to see something the girl wanted to show her in her room. By the time the two of them reappeared, dinner was almost ready. The meal proved a great success. Alice was suitably impressed by my cooking skills. "Oh, a man who can cook. Mother warned me about men like you," she teased, and was also clearly at ease with my kids, both of whom chattered away to her in response to her questions. When dessert was finished, she insisted on joining in the cleanup, and with her help, the dishes were soon cleared, rinsed, and put in the dishwasher to be run later. At that point, Ben wandered off to resume a video game he had paused, and Sophie wanted to watch a favorite program she had TiVoed. So the two adults refilled their wine glasses and wandered out to the living room. "John, everything was wonderful," Alice complimented me. "I don't know when I've had such a good time. Thank you so much for asking me. I think Sophie would never have spoken to me again if I hadn't." I laughed, and Alice joined me. "She's a wonderful young lady, and you're lucky to have her," she responded. "And her dad does pretty well too." I felt my face flush, but then Alice's face took on a more serious look. "John, in addition to having a lovely time with you, I'm glad you invited me because there's some information I want to share with you." I caught the new tone in her voice and looked at her curiously. "This is highly confidential, John, but I feel I know you well enough to trust you, and it concerns you at least indirectly." Now she definitely had my attention. "As you know," Alice began, "the NYBI had to make a routine investigation before a death certificate could be issued for your wife. And as you also know, we found nothing to give us any reason not to proceed with the declaration, which was duly issued." She took a deep breath and continued. "Naturally, we did the same thing on David Shaw, but there we found a few oddities. For one thing, it appears he was in financial trouble after a series of bad investment decisions." I nodded. What Alice said mirrored what Linda Shaw had told me. "Moreover, in the last few weeks," Alice went on, "the security department at IMC let us know that they have uncovered what appear to be significant irregularities in the Northeastern Region Accounting Department, the function that David Shaw headed. Even more disturbing, they believe they've uncovered a fraudulent invoicing scheme that may have embezzled millions of dollars from IMC, and David Shaw appears to have authorized it." "Poor Linda Shaw," I commented. "She didn't deserve this." But then I began to process what Alice had told me, and new possibilities began to arise. Could David Shaw have had a hand in the crash? I asked. Could it have been a way to cover his tracks? When Alice said nothing, my imagination went into high gear. What if Sarah found out about Martin's scheme? What if he murdered her to silence her and used the plane crash to hide the evidence? Could he still be alive? Maybe he's tucked away in some villa by the sea, laughing at all of us. "Slow down, John," Alice urged. "You're getting carried away. The most likely scenario is still that the plane went down unexpectedly, just like we've thought all along. If Martin was indeed involved in an embezzling scheme, the crash cut short his plans. We'll investigate all the possibilities, but we can't jump to conclusions, and neither should you." But it was hard for me to turn off my imagination. "You don't think Sarah could have been in on it, do you?" I asked abruptly. Alice sighed. "It's not impossible," she conceded, "but we don't think it's likely. In the first place, if she were involved, that would mean she was planning in advance to abandon her family. It's unusual for a mother to abandon her children, especially kids their age," she said, gesturing toward the kids' rooms. Martin, in contrast, had no children, and his wife has indicated that their marriage was on the rocks at the time of his disappearance. Moreover, unlike Martin, Sarah's finances were in good shape, and she did nothing prior to her disappearance that would suggest she was in on any scheme, assuming there was one. In fact, if anything, her actions were just the opposite of someone planning to disappear. But all that is just speculation. The one fact we do have, Alice went on, is that Sarah's plane did go down at sea. She had hoped to calm me, but as she looked at me, she could see that I was still upset by her revelations. John, you've got to promise me that you won't say anything about all this. It's highly confidential, and if word got out, it could jeopardize our investigation. Could also get me fired. That brought me up short. I realized that Alice had taken a risk in confiding in me, and I owed her an obligation to keep quiet. I understand, Alice, and I promise I won't compromise your investigation. But I have to ask, why did you tell me all this? She looked at me seriously. It's highly unlikely, John, but there's always the possibility that you might hear something or find out something that could help us shed light on all this. If you do, John, promise me you'll contact me right away. No Lone Ranger acts, please. I returned her look. I promise, Alice. Then I smiled. Besides, having to contact you again wouldn't be such a chore. The smile she gave me seemed to brighten the room. Shortly after that, Alice had to leave. Before doing so, she made a point of saying goodbye to both Ben and Sophie. I noted that Ben actually paused his game to say goodnight, a real compliment coming from him. Once again, Sophie walked her friend to the door, extracting a promise from Alice to call her. But this time, after Sophie had hugged her, Alice made a point of leaning back inside the door and bestowing a kiss on my cheek. As she walked to her car, Sophie looked up at me and said, "She likes you, Daddy." I smiled at my daughter and clasped her to me. Well, I like her too. After everyone had turned in for the night and the house had grown quiet, I lay in my bed chewing over what Alice had told me and all the various scenarios I had imagined. "Oh, Sarah," I thought, "what did you get yourself into?" Finally, I fell into a restless sleep. It was a week later, while I was on my computer, when I noticed something unusual. I had been reading about some of my favorite sports teams, and as I got ready to click on my Falcons bookmark, I noticed the Facebook icon just above it. On a whim, I clicked it. I was not a Facebook follower. In truth, I rarely ever visited the site. The only reason I had set up an account was to allow me to keep an eye on my children. Both Ben and Sophie loved the social networking site and used it as another way to stay in touch with their friends. I initially had no objection, but after reading a couple of scary articles about some of the pitfalls, I set up my own account and insisted that Ben and Sophie friend me. I also had them give me their passwords to their pages as well. That way, I reasoned, I could see any messages or pictures they posted as well as anything their friends sent to them. Even more important, I figured Ben and Sophie would know I could monitor them, and that, I hoped, would encourage them to be prudent. As I logged on to my own page, most of what I saw held little interest for me, but I did notice a friend request from someone I had never heard of, Mark Mason. The name didn't sound familiar, and there was no picture, only a silhouette. When I clicked on the name, the stranger's page blandly informed me that personal information was available only to friends. "Hey Ben," I yelled, "do we know a Mark Mason?" My son walked into the room and saw that I was looking at Facebook. "Oh, that guy. Just ignore him, Dad. He's been bugging me to friend him for weeks now. I just delete his requests." Sophie popped into the room just then. "Yeah, he's been trying to get me to friend him too. He's just some Facebook creep." That was enough to catch my attention. Some unknown person not only wanted to make contact with me, but also with my children. There were all kinds of scam artists out there, I knew, and a few far worse predators as well. I was alarmed, but I didn't want to frighten my children, so all I said was, "You two did exactly the right thing. Don't ever respond to anyone you don't know well over the internet." Grasping for ways to protect my family, I had a sudden idea. I wonder if Alice could help us find out who this Mason creep is. I called her at home, and she must have seen my name on caller ID because she answered warmly, "Hi, John." "Hi, Alice. I'm glad I caught you. Is there any chance you could come over? Something odd has come up, and I'd like to check it out with you if you're free. It's nothing serious. Is it? Ben and Sophie are okay, aren't they?" As I reassured her, I couldn't help but observe that she seemed as concerned about my children as I was. It gave me a warm feeling. She told me she'd been working in the yard but could be over in 45 minutes. To my surprise, almost exactly to the minute, her car pulled up to the curb. With Sarah, I remembered you were lucky if she wasn't more than an hour late trying to make her image perfect. But here was Alice, right on time, obviously freshly showered and clad in a casual but attractive outfit, with her hair nicely combed and wearing fresh makeup. It was clear that Shed made a special effort even in such a short time. "You look nice, Alice. You didn't have to get all dressed up for us," I told her. She squeezed my hand. "Thank you, John. I wanted to." Once she was in the house, I called my kids. When they came noisily into the den, I asked them to tell Alice about their Facebook friend. As the official expert in the family, Ben seized the opportunity to show off by rapidly logging on to each of the 3 family Facebook accounts in turn and retrieving the friend request from the mysterious Mark Mason. After complimenting Ben on his skill, Alice seated herself in front of the screen and called up all the unread and archived messages, but she wasn't able to uncover any additional information. Finally, she looked up at Ben and Sophie. "The most likely answer is that this is some kind of marketing ploy. If you had accepted the request, you'd probably be receiving all kinds of ads for junk you don't want or offers for imaginary gold from Nigeria. There are some bad people out there, and you should never give any information about yourself to strangers. Okay?" The 2 kids nodded solemnly, and I thought to myself that hearing that message from Alice probably had more impact on them than when I had given it. It had grown dark outside while we'd been working at the computer, and I knew my kids would soon be hungry. "Alice, we're probably going to go out to get some dinner in a little while. It won't be anything fancy, just a family-style restaurant, but we'd love to have you join us if you can." Immediately, as I had known they would, Sophie and even Ben began to clamor for her to come with us. She laughingly surrendered to the inevitable. The 4 of us piled into my sedan and headed off to a casual place not far from our home. As we drove, Alice began asking the 2 kids about some of what Shed's seen posted on their Facebook pages, and soon Sophie and Ben were eagerly talking about their friends and activities. As I listened to the conversation, I marveled. Alice probably already knows more about what's going on in Sophie's and Ben's lives than Sarah ever did. I recalled that, on the rare occasions before her death when we'd all gone out together, Sarah's conversations revolved mainly around her job. I felt guilty for my disloyalty, but I knew it was true. The lively conversation continued through dinner and the trip back home, and I was pleased when Alice came in the house with us. The kids promptly plopped themselves in front of the TV and asked Alice to come watch with them, but she begged off. "I need to talk with your dad a while." She took my hand and led me into the living room. After we were seated, her face grew serious, and she said, "I didn't want to alarm Ben and Sophie, but I don't really think those Facebook requests were a marketing ploy. The Bureau has gotten warnings about some identity theft scams, but those normally don't target children. This looks to me like someone is making a concerted effort to get information about your family." The thought of a threat to my children sent a chill through me. Who could it be? What could they want? "I don't know, John," she replied. "This doesn't seem to fit any pattern of cyberscam I've seen before. What can we do? Should I close their Facebook accounts? Should I keep them off the net altogether?" She looked thoughtful. "I don't think that's necessary as long as they're careful and don't have any interactions with strangers. And if they get nonsense emails with embedded websites, warn them never to click on the links." She thought some more and spoke up. "The trouble with the internet is that it's so amorphous. You can't tell who you're dealing with or where they are. But it's not quite as opaque as most people think. I've got a friend with the federal government who might be able to help us. He probably can't find out who Mark Mason is, but he might be able to tell us where he lives. Let me make a phone call on Monday, and he'll let you know what I find out." With that, she arose and went into the den to say goodnight to the 2 kids. When she returned, I walked her to the door, but before I opened it, I hugged her. "You've been like a guardian angel to us," I said earnestly. "I don't know what we would have done without you." She looked me in the eye for a moment, then gave me a quick kiss on the lips. "I don't know whether I want to be an angel," she said with a wink. "They don't have all that much fun." Then she turned and walked rapidly to her car, leaving me standing there bemused. True to her word, Alice called me late on Monday morning. "Do you know anyone in Palm Beach, Florida?" she asked. "Not a soul," I replied. "Well, whoever Mason is, he set up his Facebook account from a zip code that starts with 334, so he's somewhere in Palm Beach County," she said. "I can't imagine why anyone in Palm Beach would be trying to connect with us," I said, "but at least he's not anywhere nearby." "That's reassuring." "I agree," Alice said. "Furthermore, we've traced a lot of scams to South Florida, so maybe this really is only some new kind of internet scheme. Just be sure Ben and Sophie don't have anything to do with those friend requests." "I will, Alice, and thanks. I feel a lot better about all this. I'm so glad I could help, John." Despite what I had said to Alice, I was not reassured at all. On the contrary, I felt as though my children and I were under a continuous assault. First had come the terrible news of Sarah's death, followed by poor Ben's revelation that his mother had cheated on me. Then I had been told that Sarah might have been involved in some crooked business dealings before her death. And now some unknown person was trying to get information on my children. I felt like we were under siege, and I decided I was going to fight back. My first priority was to find the enemy in Palm Beach County and confront him. But how could I do that? A quick check online showed the county had a total population of 1.3 million. Searching for Mark Mason would be like looking for a short stick in high grass. Besides, I thought the name was just as likely to be a phony. My orderly mind continued to wrestle with the problem. Then an idea hit me. If I can't find Mason, maybe I can get him to find me. A plan began to take shape in my head. It's a long shot, I admitted, but it's all I've got. The first thing I had to do was to get Ben and Sophie safely out of the way. It was almost time for summer vacation, and that gave me an idea. I dialed the number of my in-laws. Dad, would you and Mom be interested in having Ben and Sophie come visit for a week? I've got to make a trip out of town during that time, so it would really help me if you could. When the children's grandfather had gladly agreed and the logistics of their stay were arranged, I hung up and immediately called Delta. I'd like to book a flight to Palm Beach. My kids were excited to hear about the upcoming visit to their grandparents, but their enthusiasm was dampened when they learned I wasn't coming with them. This would be the first time we'd been separated since their mother's death, and the prospect brought back some of the fear of abandonment they'd been dealing with ever since that painful time. I hated to cause my children any kind of distress, but I felt I had to do what I had planned, so I managed to persuade them. The week before their visit was to begin, I found myself beset with doubts. Am I doing the right thing? I kept asking myself. But despite my uncertainty, the thought of doing nothing was even worse. My inner turmoil was interrupted briefly by a phone call from Alice, calling to inquire how I and my family were doing. After chatting a few minutes, her tone of voice changed slightly, and I thought she sounded almost shy. I was wondering if you'd like to get together next week. It's been a while since I've seen you and the kids. And her voice trailed off uncertainly. I'd love to do that, Alice, but am taking the kids to see their grandparents. Then we'll be gone all week. Oh, she said. I understand. Maybe some other time. I'd really like that, Alice, I said fervently. I had hated to lie to Alice about my plans, but I told myself at least it was partly true. Besides, I was sure I knew what she would say if I had revealed my true plans. When I returned home after dropping my children off at my in-laws' home in the country, I immediately sat down at the family computer. One of the reasons I'd asked Sarah's family to take my kids was that I knew they didn't have a computer. Accordingly, I felt safe in logging on to Sophie's Facebook account. Sure enough, there was a friend request from Mark Mason. I clicked on the accept option and quickly received confirmation that Sophie was now friends with the stranger. If nothing comes of this, I thought, they'll just unfriend him later. Next came the most difficult part, pretending to be a 12-year-old girl. I had studied my daughter's previous postings, and I thought I could do an acceptable job of emulating her style. I probably won't fool her friends, I admitted to myself, but hopefully I can fool Mark Mason. I decided my first post should set the stage, so I wrote a brief note mentioning Sophie's visit to the country. Just a little update for her friends, I thought. Nothing to make a lurker suspicious. The next day was when I planned to set the trap. OMG, I'm going to Florida. My BFF Alice offered to take me with her, and Daddy said yes, leaving tomorrow. Can't wait. I decided to use Alice's name because I felt neither Sophie's friends nor Mark Mason would know her. I hoped Alice wouldn't mind. Now that the bait was in the water, I hoped to wiggle it enough to attract the fish's attention. I can't believe I'm in Palm Beach. It's to die for. That evening, I posted the next installment, spent the day at the beach. I'm going to be so tan. The next morning, I posted the note that I hoped would set the hook heading back to the beach today. Tomorrow Alice is taking me shopping on Worth Avenue. We're going to have lunch at Taboo. Too cool. As soon as the entry appeared on Sophie's page, I headed for Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Soon I was settled in for the 2-hour flight to Palm Beach. As I gazed out the window, I recalled that I had been to Palm Beach once before. In fact, Sarah and I had driven through the city on our way back from our honeymoon in Miami Beach. We'd taken the bridge across Lake Worth and then driven along South Ocean Boulevard, gawking at the mansions overlooking the Atlantic. Upon landing, I picked up a rental car and drove to the motel in West Palm Beach where ID made reservations. There was a fast food restaurant across the street, and I picked up a sandwich and a cola that I ate in my room while studying a map of the city on my laptop. I hope I'm doing the right thing, I thought. Following breakfast, I checked Sophie's Facebook page, but all I found were a few envious replies from classmates of hers. I hadn't really expected any contact from Mason, but I had hoped for some kind of indication that my fishing expedition might land something. About 10, I got in my car and drove east across the Royal Park Bridge, turned south, and then east again onto Worth Avenue. I wanted to be in position early, and I needed to park my car on the street so I could get to it quickly if need be. After circling the block where the restaurant was located numerous times, I began to wonder if ID miscalculated. But suddenly, a car pulled out just ahead of me, and I was able to pull into the vacated parking spot. After feeding the meter, I walked along the street in front of the restaurant. Spotting a bench in the shade, I gratefully took a seat. ID brought along a baseball cap and sunglasses, and I put those on in hopes of disguising myself. Then I pulled out a copy of the Palm Beach Post and pretended to read while scanning the street. As I sat there, the realization of how flimsy my plan was slowly began to sink in. I had no idea if the mysterious Mark Mason had even seen the phony postings on Sophie's Facebook page, nor if he would show up in response. Even worse, I had no idea for whom I was looking. Unless the mystery man turned out to be David Shaw, which I had to admit was pretty unlikely, how would I identify the threat? All I could hope was to spot someone acting suspiciously, whatever that meant. The street was crowded, and I kept busy trying to watch all the passers-by. The restaurant began to fill up, and as I watched people entering, my stomach began to growl. I cursed myself for not thinking to bring along a sandwich, but I dared not leave my post. Time slowly crept by as I sat there, and after a while, I saw that the restaurant crowd was beginning to thin out. A glance at my watch told me it was after 1. What an idiot, I thought. I wouldn't have been any worse off if ID stayed home, and at least I could have seen Alice again. As I watched the window shoppers stroll by, my eyes were caught by a woman strolling on the other side of the street. In doing it again, I thought, seeing Sarah in a crowd of strangers. In fact, I noted the woman really didn't look like Sarah at all. Sarah had shoulder-length brunette hair. This woman was a blonde with her hair cut short. Likewise, her clothes were a different style than anything I'd ever seen Sarah wear. But there was something about her that looked eerily familiar. As I continued to watch, I realized it was the way she walked that had triggered my reaction. Impulsively, I stood up and started to walk after her. Looking down the street, I saw the blonde had reached the corner and was trying to flag down a taxi. Risking his life, I ran across Worth Avenue and jumped in my car. Just as I was pulling away from the curb, I saw the woman clamber into the back of a cab and start off down the avenue toward the Atlantic. Before it came to South Ocean Boulevard, the cab turned left on County Road and began driving north. I followed at a distance. Finally, I saw the cab turn left on a suburban street and continue until it almost reached Lake Worth. I pulled my car to the side of the road about a football field's length away and watched as the woman paid the driver and then went into an elegant home that appeared to front on the lake. I squinted my eyes in an effort to see her clearly. With her hair color and short hairdo, she looked nothing like Sarah, but she was the same height and weight, and as she proceeded up the walkway to the house, I was again struck by her walk. As I sat there in the car, I suddenly remembered a book I had read long ago. In the story, an actor found it necessary to disguise himself, but rather than use a false mustache or wig, he simply put pebbles in his shoes. If someone sees me, the actor told a friend, they'll say, that looks kind of like the guy, but it's not him because he'll be walking differently. It works the other way too, I thought. As I remembered the book, I grew more and more certain that I had just seen my late wife. Trying to control my rising anger, I ran down the street and up to the door. I rang the doorbell and then crossed my arms to wait. When the woman opened the door, she looked at me with a puzzled glance. Then she did a double take and shrieked, "John, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Sarah. Funny running into you here," I said sarcastically. After a moment's hesitation, she threw her arms wide to embrace me, but I quickly held my hands up to stop her. "Don't touch me," I snarled. Then I could no longer constrain my anger, and I yelled, "How could you do this to me? How could you abandon Ben and Sophie?" Glancing anxiously toward the street behind me, Sarah grabbed my arm and pulled me into the house, pushing the door closed behind me. I did it all for you, baby. For you and the kids, she said urgently. You've got to believe me. It was the only way. As she spoke, she kept glancing around nervously. What in the hell are you talking about? I demanded hotly. You're not making sense. None of this makes any sense. Sit down, baby, she urged me. You've got to let me explain. She was still speaking loudly and was nervously rubbing her hands together as she took a seat and encouraged me to do so. An icy calm came over me as I sat down. All right, Sarah, I'm listening. I was so close, baby. I had the big job I wanted in my pocket. But then the damned economy began to tank. I knew if I could just keep the region's numbers up a little while longer, the economy would come back, and the promotion would be in the bag. She gave me a pleading smile and held her hands palm out toward me. And, John, once I got that job, would have been on easy street, no worries about paying for college for the kids. No worries about retirement, no worries ever again. I could barely contain myself. This was all about money and your position in the company. Sarah's hands fell back in her lap. So, David and I. David Shaw, I said darkly. Yes, she went on, not reading my mood. You met him. Anyway, he and I figured out a way to pull some sales forward from our biggest accounts. We knew they'd come through eventually. We just booked them early in the current quarter. All the other regions were reporting big sales declines, and we were pulling in major increases. Corporate was just blown away. We earned the biggest bonuses the company has ever paid, she said proudly. Then the smile slipped from her face like a tissue dropping to the floor. But the economy got worse instead of better, and when David told me it was all going to come out eventually, I knew we had to do something. We knew we'd need a lot of cash to pull it off, so David set up a dummy supplier account and began sending fake invoices to IMC. They're so sloppy and wasteful at that place, they never even noticed. So you plan to fake your deaths in a plane crash to cover your tracks? I asked. That's right, baby, she said as though I were her star pupil. With enough money, it's not hard to get somebody to leave a Zodiac motorboat with a GPS signal out in the Caribbean. We just homed in on the signal and crash-landed right beside it. So the whole thing was just a way to steal a bunch of money and abandon your family? I asked bitterly. No, baby, she protested. That's not it at all. I knew I'd have to get out of sight for a while, but I made sure you and the kids would be okay. I loaded up on life insurance and put everything I could into my 401k so you guys would have plenty of money, she said proudly. And you thought having enough money would make up for losing my wife and their mother? This time she heard the bitterness. No, baby, no. You don't understand. I was going to come back for you. Once everything had had a chance to blow over, I was going to contact you. We could go someplace safe, baby. We could be together. As she spoke, her eyes continued to dart around the room. I looked at her with a stony gaze. There's just one thing you've left out, I said in a flat voice. What's that, baby? She asked. You forgot the part about you screwing David Shaw, I said. She was startled at first, but then she stood and lifted her arms to me. No, baby, it wasn't like that. David and I just worked together. We were never more than colleagues at work. Don't lie to me, Sarah, I snapped. Ben saw you two together in our bedroom. She gasped. Oh my God. Ben saw us. Oh, that's terrible. A sob caught in her throat. But then she recovered and straightened up again. It was just the one time, baby. He told me he wouldn't help me unless I gave myself to him. But it was just the one time. I swear it. I stood up, ignoring her. I looked around. Come on out, David, I said loudly. I know you're back there somewhere. Sarah continued to wail. No, baby, it's just me. It was just the one time. But before she could continue, David Shaw emerged from the bedroom. He was wearing a bathrobe, and his hands were stuffed in his pockets. Give it up, Sarah. He knows, Martin snarled. Even though I guessed that the two of them had been living together, hearing Martin use my wife's pet name caused me to bristle. Sarah began to weep. He must have found us through Facebook. Martin hissed at her. I warned you, but you just had to check up on your two brats. Then his tone changed to something cold and hard. But it doesn't matter now. We've got to get out of here. He turned to me and, from the pocket of his robe, pulled a snub-nosed automatic which he brandished in my direction. As for you, bright boy, you're the only one who knows we're still alive. No, David, no, Sarah screamed. But Martin ignored her. It looks like your kids are going to lose their daddy as well as their mommy, he said with a sneer as he raised the gun at me. I wouldn't do that if I were you, came a voice from the entry hall. All three of us jerked around to look in amazement as the figure of Alice Walker emerged, holding her Smith Wesson automatic leveled at Martin. Before he could react, a second voice spoke up from behind him. "Drop the gun, Martin. It's all over." Special Agent Jack Barnes stepped out of the kitchen, his pistol also trained on Martin. The former accounting executive glared at the two agents with hostility, but then his shoulders slumped, and he dropped the gun to the carpet and slowly raised his hands. While Barnes kept his weapon trained on Martin, Alice swiftly stepped behind the sullen man and twisted one of his arms behind his back, cuffing him at the wrist. Then she swung his other arm down and clicked the second cuff shut. Once Martin was secure, she repeated the process with Sarah. When the two were lying on the floor, Barnes got on his cell phone to the Palm Beach Police Department. A second call went to the local FBI office. In a short while, the house was swarming with uniformed and plainclothes officers. I just stood to one side, looking on in a daze. As the two fugitives were being led away, I peered carefully at them both. Martin was muttering to himself, and Sarah was weeping. Neither glanced in my direction. When they were gone, Alice went over to Barnes and gave him a hug and a kiss on the cheek. "Thanks for coming with me, partner. I owe you big time." The older agent smiled. "No, you don't owe me anything. Solving this case is going to look real good on both our records." As Barnes left, Alice finally looked at me. To my amazement, she walked over to me, threw her arms around my neck, and began to sob. "You big idiot. Don't you ever do that to me again. You could have gotten yourself killed." I held her tightly until her crying subsided. Then I tilted her back away from me enough to look at her face. "What are you doing here? How did you know where to find me?" She smiled through her tears. "Sophie called me to chat. When she told me that you weren't with them at their grandparents' house, I got suspicious. You were going to do something stupid and started checking around. When I saw her posts on Facebook, I called the airlines and found out you had booked a flight to Palm Beach. I talked Jack into coming with me, and we've been following you ever since this morning." She shook her head. "We almost lost you when you took off after that taxi, but Jack guessed which way you'd turned, and he was right." I held her even tighter. "I guess you really are my guardian angel," I said and kissed her. 2 years later, I pulled the collar of my coat tighter around my neck. The humidity was high as always, and the wind off Puget Sound was cold and damp. Still, I thought, it feels good to be here. The past 2 years had been hard in many ways. While it had been a terrible shock to me to find my wife alive, the impact on Ben and Sophie was even worse. Having to see her brought to trial and convicted on multiple criminal charges only added to the family's pain. During the inevitable media frenzy surrounding the arrest and trial, I feared my kids wouldn't make it through it. The divorce was a mere formality. Sarah might no longer be legally dead, but she would be spending the next 12 years of her life in Arendelle State Prison. International Marketing Corporation, of course, demanded that I return not only Sarah's life insurance but also the bulk of her 401k since it had been funded based on bonuses she had not earned. As an innocent party, I might have had a case for keeping some of the funds, but I wanted nothing to do with any portion of the money from my ex-wife. Instead, I began an urgent search for a job since my family's savings were all but exhausted. The offer I got from a major aerospace company was a welcome one, not only because it would ensure the means to provide for my family but also because it meant a relocation across the country. There were too many reminders of Sarah in Atlanta and too many questions from friends and others that I and my children couldn't answer. Finding a new place to live and work seemed like the best solution for all of us. I hated to leave the state where I and my children were born, but I was ready to embrace the Pacific Northwest and start a new life. We'd gotten lucky on the sale of our Atlanta home and were able to buy a nice, if somewhat smaller, house in Seattle. Sarah had always wanted to live in a showplace. I was happy with something cozier. The kids seemed to like it too, and they were already making friends at their new school. I came in off the deck and looked around for my car keys. Finding them, I stuck my head in the kitchen to look for my wife. "Come on, Angel. Let's go pick up our kids." Alice smiled happily at me. Thanks for watching. What would you do if a loved one faked their death? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more thrilling stories. See you next time.